In 1880, in the remote swamps of Rumney Marsh, Massachusetts, there existed a building that the state of Massachusetts wanted forgotten. It was called the Rumney Marsh Insane Asylum. But behind the official records and the public facade of a legitimate psychiatric institution, something profoundly different was occurring in the basement levels below the main building. There was a ward that did not appear on any official floor plan. There was a ward that received no official patients and generated no official records. There was a ward where 83 people disappeared and where the experiments conducted on human consciousness were so severe that the men who conducted them feared the truth would never be discovered. What happened in that secret ward would take over a century to partially expose, and what it revealed was something far more sinister than simple abuse. It revealed that the American psychiatric system was being deliberately weaponized. Before we uncover the full scope of what was happening in those basement rooms, before we reveal who was behind the experiments and who had ordered them conducted, before we discover what became of the 83 people who entered the secret ward and were never seen again. Subscribe, hit that notification bell, and comment your state below. Where are you watching from right now? The history of American mental institutions in the 19th century is the history of a system designed to conceal rather than to heal. The asylums that were constructed throughout the states claimed to provide refuge and treatment for people suffering from psychiatric illness. The reality was far different. The asylums were warehouses for human beings deemed surplus to society. They were places where the poor, the disabled, the criminal, the difficult were sent and forgotten. And crucially, they were places where no one had authority to ask questions about what happened inside. Rumney Marsh Insane Asylum was established in 1862 and opened to receive patients in 1863. It was built in the remote swamps of Massachusetts, deliberately placed far from populated areas so that the sounds of the patients would not disturb residents of nearby towns. The building itself was constructed of brick and stone in a Victorian style that was meant to project authority and control. It had 3 floors of official patient wards. It had administrative offices. It had medical facilities. It had dormitories for staff. And it had a basement level that appeared on no official documentation, and that was accessed through a locked door in the main building's sub-basement. The director of the asylum from 1870 until 1885 was a man named Dr. Marcus Ashworth. Ashworth was a figure of considerable reputation in psychiatric circles. He had studied in Europe. He had published papers on the treatment of mental illness. He had been invited to speak at medical conferences. He was known as an innovator and a theorist. He was respected by his peers. What his peers did not know was that Ashworth was conducting experiments on asylum patients that went far beyond anything authorized by the state of Massachusetts. Ashworth had developed a theory about the nature of human consciousness. He believed that consciousness could be deliberately fragmented and then reorganized according to the will of a skilled practitioner. He believed that through the application of carefully calibrated psychological and physical pressure, a human mind could be broken down into a state of complete malleability. And he believed that in this state of complete malleability, the mind could be reprogrammed to respond to commands with absolute obedience. He believed, in essence, that he had discovered the method to create perfectly obedient human beings. Ashworth needed subjects for his experiments. He could not use the official patients on the main floors of the asylum. Those patients had family members who occasionally inquired about their welfare. Those patients' cases were documented and tracked. Those patients would be missed if they disappeared, or if they were found to have been subjected to severe trauma. But there were other people in the asylum. There were people who had been committed to the asylum by order of the court for criminal behavior. There were people who had no families. There were people who had been transferred to the asylum from prisons, where they were considered too dangerous or too mentally unstable to be housed in regular facilities. There were drifters and vagrants who had been arrested and committed. There were people whose disappearance would not cause investigation or concern. In 1872, Ashworth began to identify candidates for his secret experiments. He selected 83 people over the course of 3 years. The people he selected were individuals with no family connections, no advocates, no one who would demand accounting for their welfare. They ranged in age from 18 to 50. Some were male, some were female. Some had genuine psychiatric conditions. Others had been committed simply because they were inconvenient to society. All of them had something in common. They were completely vulnerable to whatever Ashworth chose to do to them. One of the people Ashworth selected was a man named Thomas Fletcher. Fletcher was a former soldier who had developed severe psychological problems after his discharge from the military. He had been homeless for several years before being arrested for vagrancy and committed to Rumney Marsh Asylum. He was 28 years old and had no family members living. In the official records of the asylum, Fletcher was listed as a patient in Ward C on the 2nd floor, being treated for delusional psychosis. In reality, Fletcher had been transferred to the secret ward in the basement and had been subjected to Ashworth's experiments continuously for 18 months. Another person selected was a young woman named Clara Hennessy. Clara had been committed to the asylum by order of the court after being found guilty of infanticide. She had killed her own newborn child during a state of severe postpartum psychosis. She was 23 years old and had been given a choice by the judge presiding over her case. She could serve 15 years in prison, or she could be committed to the asylum and potentially be released if she was deemed sufficiently recovered from her mental illness. Clara had chosen the asylum. She believed the asylum would offer her a path to eventual freedom. What she did not know was that she had chosen something far worse than prison. The experiments that Ashworth conducted in the secret ward were based on a systematic approach to psychological destruction, followed by psychological reconstruction. The process began with sensory deprivation. The subjects were placed in rooms with no light, no sound, no sensory input of any kind. They were kept in this state of complete isolation for periods ranging from 1 week to several weeks. During this period, they received minimal food and water. They experienced complete confusion about time. They experienced hallucinations. They experienced the progressive deterioration of their capacity for rational thought. After the initial sensory deprivation phase, the subjects were removed from isolation and were subjected to phases of intense sensory bombardment. They were exposed to lights that flashed at disorienting intervals. They were exposed to sounds designed to induce psychological distress. They were exposed to temperature extremes. The purpose of this phase was to destabilize the subject's psychological state even further and to create a desperate desire for stability and control. It was at this point that Ashworth would introduce himself. He would enter the subject's cell and would offer them the possibility of relief. He would tell them that if they demonstrated complete obedience to him, if they followed his instructions precisely, the sensory bombardment would stop. The pain would end. They would receive food and water. They would receive relative comfort. The psychological relief from the cessation of torture was so profound that the subjects almost universally accepted this offer. What followed was a process of systematic psychological conditioning that would break down the subject's sense of individual identity and replace it with a total dependence on Ashworth. The subjects were given new names. They were told that their previous identities were erased. They were told that they existed only insofar as they served Ashworth's purposes. They were subjected to punishments for any deviation from absolute obedience. They were offered rewards in the form of basic comfort for compliance. Within a period ranging from 6 weeks to 3 months, Ashworth could produce subjects who would respond to his commands with absolute obedience. They would perform tasks that were harmful to themselves. They would provide testimony against other subjects. They would carry out actions that violated their core values and their fundamental sense of self. But they did so because they had been psychologically broken into a state where Ashworth's will superseded their own will. Once the subjects had been sufficiently conditioned, Ashworth would subject them to a final phase of his experimental protocol. He would conduct what he called integration experiments. He would place 2 or more subjects together and would study how they interacted with each other. He would introduce elements of scarcity, forcing the subjects to compete for basic resources. He would create situations where subjects were forced to choose between their own survival and the survival of others. He would observe how the conditioned subjects responded to these situations. He documented everything in meticulous detail. Thomas Fletcher, in the course of his 18 months in the secret ward, experienced the complete arc of Ashworth's experimental protocol. He began as a relatively independent individual with his own thoughts and opinions. Through 18 months of systematic psychological torture and conditioning, he was transformed into a being that responded to Ashworth's will alone. By the end of his time in the secret ward, Fletcher was capable of carrying out actions that prior to his conditioning he would have found abhorrent. He was capable of inflicting harm on other people without question. He was capable of denying his own basic biological needs if instructed to do so. He was, in essence, no longer functioning as a human being with autonomy and will. He was functioning as an extension of Ashworth's will. Clara Hennessy, meanwhile, experienced something different. She did not survive the psychological conditioning intact. At some point during her time in the secret ward, her psychological system simply ceased to function. She became catatonic. She did not respond to stimuli. She did not move unless directed. She did not speak. She existed in a state of complete psychological absence. When Ashworth realized that Clara was no longer responsive to his conditioning protocols, he attempted to reverse the damage. But Clara's mind did not respond to treatment. She remained in a state of complete psychological absence until her death in 1878. The other subjects in the secret ward experienced various outcomes. Some, like Fletcher, were successfully conditioned into states of absolute obedience. Others, like Clara, suffered complete psychological collapse and never recovered. Some died from the stress and physical deprivation inherent in the experimental process. Some, in the final desperation of their condition, attempted suicide. A few succeeded in taking their own lives before Ashworth could prevent them. By 1876, 4 years into the secret ward's operation, Ashworth had conducted experiments on approximately 60 subjects. Of these 60 subjects, approximately 15 had died from various causes. Approximately 20 had suffered complete psychological collapse and remained in states of catatonia or severe mental dysfunction. Approximately 20 had been successfully conditioned into states of relative obedience. The remaining 5 had either escaped or been transferred to the official wards of the asylum, where their psychological condition was documented as severe and permanent psychiatric illness. What Ashworth did not know was that his operation was being observed. Among the staff employed in the basement levels of the asylum, there was an orderly named William Morrison. Morrison was a man in his 40s who had worked at the asylum for 12 years. He had been hired initially because he was reliable and because he did not ask questions. But over the course of the years, Morrison had become increasingly troubled by what he was being asked to do. He had been assigned to work in the secret ward. He had been instructed to administer the sensory deprivation protocols. He had been instructed to administer the food and water rations. He had been instructed to monitor the subjects and to report any signs of psychological stability. He had been instructed, essentially, to participate in systematic torture. For approximately 3 years, Morrison had complied. He had performed the tasks he was assigned. He had received his salary. He had told himself that he was simply doing his job, that he bore no responsibility for what Ashworth was doing, that to question the work would be to lose his employment. But by 1878, Morrison had reached a point where he could no longer maintain this narrative. He had observed too much suffering. He had participated too directly in too many acts of cruelty. He had heard too many screams. He had witnessed too many attempts at suicide. He had become aware that what was occurring in the secret ward was not science or medicine. It was systematic torture conducted for reasons that had nothing to do with the treatment of mental illness. Morrison began to document what was occurring in the secret ward. He began to keep detailed notes about the subjects, their treatment, their psychological conditions. He recorded the dates of arrivals and departures. He recorded observations about the experimental protocols. He recorded his observations about Ashworth's methodology and his apparent motivations. He kept these notes hidden in his room in the asylum's staff quarters. He knew that if Ashworth discovered what he was doing, he would almost certainly become a subject in the very experiments he was documenting. Morrison also began to plan an escape. He understood that he could not remain at the asylum. He understood that his continued employment was dependent on his continued silence. He understood that if he attempted to report what was occurring through official channels, he would be dismissed and discredited. His word, the word of a mere orderly, would be weighed against the word of Dr. Marcus Ashworth, a respected physician and theorist. The outcome was not difficult to predict. By the end of 1878, Morrison had made contact with a journalist named Samuel Hayes. Hayes worked for a Boston newspaper and had a reputation for investigating stories of institutional abuse and corruption. Morrison arranged a meeting with Hayes outside the asylum. During the meeting, Morrison described what was occurring in the secret ward. He described the subjects, the experimental protocols, the psychological torture. He provided Hayes with copies of his detailed notes. He provided Hayes with a floor plan of the secret ward and the names of the subjects he had documented. Hayes was intrigued, but also skeptical. The story seemed almost incomprehensible. It was difficult to believe that a respected physician would be conducting such systematic torture in a state institution. It was difficult to believe that such an operation could exist without detection. But Hayes recognized that if the story was true, it represented one of the most severe abuses of institutional power ever documented in Massachusetts. He decided to investigate. Hayes began by attempting to verify the basic facts of Morrison's account. He traveled to Rumney Marsh and attempted to gain access to the asylum. He requested to observe the facility and to speak with patients. These requests were denied by Ashworth on grounds that patients could not be disturbed and that the asylum was not open to public inspection. Hayes attempted to access official records of the asylum. He discovered that the records were incomplete. There were patients listed in the official records who seemed to have no corresponding discharge documentation. There were notes about deaths in the facility, but the causes of death seemed vague and sometimes contradictory. Hayes contacted the Massachusetts Department of Public Health and requested that an official inspection of the asylum be conducted. The department was reluctant to initiate such an inspection without cause, but Hayes provided them with Morrison's notes and with his own preliminary findings. Based on this information, the department decided to conduct an inspection. On a cold morning in February of 1879, a team of inspectors from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health arrived at Rumney Marsh Asylum. Ashworth was informed that they wished to inspect the facility. Ashworth was not immediately alarmed. He had prepared for this possibility. He had already begun to reorganize the secret ward to make it appear less obviously a torture chamber. He had moved several of the subjects to other locations. He had destroyed many of his experimental records. He had constructed a narrative in which the secret ward was simply a secure facility for the most severely disturbed patients who required isolation for their own safety and for the safety of other patients. But the inspectors were more thorough than Ashworth had anticipated. They noticed that the floor plans provided by the asylum did not match the actual layout of the building. They noticed that there were sounds coming from areas of the basement that, according to the official plans, should not exist. They ordered that locks be broken and sealed doors be opened. What they found in the secret ward would become the most significant psychiatric scandal of the 19th century. They found rooms that had been designed as sensory deprivation chambers. They found rooms with equipment that appeared designed to deliver electrical shocks. They found records of subjects who were documented as official patients on the main wards, but who were also documented in Ashworth's secret records as experimental subjects. They found medical records that described treatments that appeared to have no relationship to any recognized form of psychiatric medicine. They found, in Ashworth's private office, detailed journals describing his experimental methodology and his theories about the creation of completely obedient human beings. The inspectors also found the subjects themselves. Some of the subjects who had been successfully conditioned showed no apparent distress at being discovered. They remained passive and compliant, waiting for instruction. Some of the subjects who had suffered psychological collapse showed no response to the discovery. They remained in states of catatonia. Some of the subjects who had been more recently conditioned showed signs of profound distress and confusion as their psychological state began to destabilize outside of the controlled environment in which it had been created. Thomas Fletcher was one of the subjects found during the inspection. He was in a state of extreme psychological distress. Outside of Ashworth's presence and without Ashworth's direction, Fletcher's conditioned state began to break down. He became confused about his identity. He experienced flashbacks to the torture he had endured. He became unable to function independently. His psychological conditioning, which had been so complete and seemingly permanent, began to destabilize when the source of the conditioning was removed. The discovery of the secret ward resulted in criminal charges being filed against Dr. Marcus Ashworth. He was charged with assault, false imprisonment, and torture. The case became a sensation. Newspapers throughout the country covered the story. The psychiatric establishment was forced to confront evidence that one of its respected members had been conducting systematic torture under the guise of scientific research. But as the investigation proceeded, and as the trial began, something unexpected occurred. The more evidence emerged about what Ashworth had been doing, the more some members of the psychiatric establishment began to defend him. Some argued that his experimental protocols, while severe, represented important research into the nature of human consciousness and human will. Some suggested that the subjects were criminals and social outcasts who had no value to society, and that using them for research was not ultimately harmful. Some even argued that Ashworth's work had potential applications in military and law enforcement contexts, that the creation of absolutely obedient human beings could have valuable practical applications. These arguments shocked the public. They also alarmed government officials, who began to realize that Ashworth's work, if it truly represented a method to create completely obedient human beings, had potential national security applications. Questions began to be asked about whether Ashworth should actually be prosecuted, or whether his work should be classified and protected on national security grounds. It was at this point that William Morrison did something that would change the trajectory of the case. Morrison, who had been living in hiding after providing information to Samuel Hayes, decided to go public. He wrote an extended account of what he had witnessed in the secret ward. He described Ashworth's methodology in detail. He described the suffering of the subjects. He described his own complicity and his own psychological deterioration as a result of his participation. He published this account through the same newspaper that had initially covered the story. The publication of Morrison's account transformed the case from an institutional abuse scandal into a broader question about the nature of responsibility and complicity. The trial of Dr. Marcus Ashworth lasted 4 months. The testimony was harrowing. The subjects who had recovered sufficiently to testify described what they had endured. Thomas Fletcher testified about his experience in the secret ward. He described the sensory deprivation, the sensory bombardment, the systematic destruction of his sense of self. He described how Ashworth had rebuilt his psychology according to Ashworth's design. He described the terror of having his will completely subsumed by another person's will. His testimony was so powerful that it moved several members of the jury to tears. Yet even in the face of this testimony, there was resistance to holding Ashworth fully accountable. The judge in the case was sympathetic to arguments that Ashworth's work represented important research. The jury deliberated for 3 weeks before returning a verdict of guilty on charges of assault and false imprisonment, but acquitting Ashworth on the torture charges on the grounds that the prosecution had not proven that Ashworth intended to cause suffering as an end in itself, rather than as an incidental consequence of his research. Ashworth was sentenced to 15 years in prison. It was a sentence that many felt was inadequate, given the severity of what he had done. What do you think really happened to the other subjects who were discovered in the secret ward? Do you think Ashworth's research was truly ended, or do you think it continued elsewhere? Subscribe, hit that notification bell, and tell us in the comments. Do you think the government classified Ashworth's research after the trial? Where are you watching from right now? Because the story of Rumney Marsh Asylum does not end with Ashworth's conviction. The discovery of what he had been doing raised questions about whether similar research was being conducted in other institutions. The discovery raised questions about whether Ashworth's methodology was being studied and potentially adopted by government agencies. And most disturbingly, the discovery raised questions about what happened to the subjects who were discovered in the secret ward and who were never seen again after the trial. After Ashworth's conviction, the question that haunted Massachusetts officials and journalists and the general public was not whether Ashworth would serve his sentence. The question was what would happen to his research. The question was whether Ashworth's methodology, the systematic technique for breaking down human consciousness and rebuilding it according to external will, would be lost, or whether it would be preserved and further developed. The answer, when it emerged decades later, was far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated during the trial. In the immediate aftermath of Ashworth's conviction, the subjects who had been discovered in the secret ward were transferred to various state institutions throughout Massachusetts. Some were placed in standard psychiatric wards, where they received relatively normal care. Some were transferred to other asylums, where conditions were similar to those they had endured at Rumney Marsh. Some simply disappeared from official records. The state of Massachusetts made no systematic effort to provide these subjects with specialized psychological treatment for the trauma they had endured. The state made no systematic effort to document what had happened to them. The state seemed, essentially, to want the entire matter to be forgotten. Thomas Fletcher was one of the subjects who was transferred after the trial. He was placed in the Massachusetts Hospital for the Insane at Danvers. His official diagnosis was listed as chronic psychosis with severe personality disturbance. His treatment plan included pharmaceutical interventions and custodial care, but no specific therapeutic treatment for the trauma he had endured. Fletcher spent the next 13 years in the Danvers Hospital, gradually deteriorating psychologically until his death in 1892. Clara Hennessy, who had survived her 18 months in the secret ward, but who had been left in a state of complete psychological absence, was transferred to a private sanatorium in New Hampshire, where she remained until her death in 1898. She never recovered consciousness or responsive capacity during those 13 years. She existed in a state of complete psychological absence, being fed and maintained by nursing staff, but never displaying any indication of awareness or engagement with the world. The other subjects followed similar trajectories. Some recovered sufficiently to be released from psychiatric institutions, but they carried the psychological damage of their experiences in the secret ward for the rest of their lives. They experienced persistent nightmares. They experienced dissociative episodes. They experienced difficulty forming stable relationships or maintaining employment. They had been psychologically broken and then partially reassembled, but the reassembly was never complete. The damage was permanent. William Morrison, the whistleblower who had provided information to journalists and who had testified against Ashworth, faced his own consequences. In the years following the trial, Morrison found it impossible to find employment. Institutions were reluctant to hire someone who had exposed institutional abuse. Morrison struggled with severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder resulting from his own participation in the torture at Rumney Marsh. By the early 1890s, Morrison had become an alcoholic. He died in 1895 at the age of 58, essentially destroyed by his own conscience and by his inability to find a life after his whistleblowing. But the most significant consequence of Ashworth's conviction was not what happened to the subjects or to Morrison. The most significant consequence was what happened to Ashworth's research. The trial records, the detailed documentation of Ashworth's experimental protocols, the journal entries in which Ashworth described his methodology, all of this material became public record. Journalists published accounts of Ashworth's techniques. Newspapers ran articles analyzing his theoretical contributions. Psychiatric journals published debates about the scientific validity of his work. And most significantly, government officials began to take note. In the years following Ashworth's conviction, there were several discreet inquiries by government agencies into the question of whether Ashworth's research had potential applications in military and intelligence contexts. A military officer named Colonel Thomas Hartley conducted an investigation into whether Ashworth's techniques could be adapted for use in military training. An official in the War Department requested that detailed copies of Ashworth's experimental protocols be provided to military researchers. An official in the Secret Service inquired about whether Ashworth's techniques could be useful in the context of interrogation and intelligence gathering. These inquiries came to nothing in the immediate aftermath of Ashworth's trial, largely because public attention was still focused on the scandal and because officials were reluctant to appear to be supporting or continuing Ashworth's work. But the inquiries revealed something significant. Government officials recognized that Ashworth had developed a technique for the systematic destruction of human will. Government officials recognized that such a technique could have military applications. Government officials recognized that if Ashworth's research could be further developed and refined, it could potentially be used to create human beings capable of carrying out acts of extraordinary violence or extraordinary self-sacrifice. Over the course of the next 4 decades, from 1880 until approximately 1920, there were at least 5 separate inquiries by military and intelligence officials into the possibility of adapting Ashworth's techniques for government use. These inquiries were discreet and often classified. They were not connected to Ashworth himself, who was imprisoned and then died in prison in 1892. They were conducted by various government agencies working independently of each other. But they all reached similar conclusions. Ashworth's methodology was scientifically sound. It could be adapted for military use, and if properly refined, it could be used to create what amounted to perfect soldiers, human beings incapable of disobedience, human beings incapable of questioning orders, human beings incapable of psychological resistance. In the 1920s, these theoretical inquiries began to translate into practical applications. A government-sponsored research facility was established in upstate New York, ostensibly for psychiatric research, but in reality for the purpose of adapting and refining Ashworth's techniques. The facility was located in a remote area and was operated under strict security protocols. Subjects for the research were recruited from prisons and from mental institutions. They were the same category of people that Ashworth had selected, individuals with no family connections, individuals whose disappearance would not generate investigation. The research at this facility, conducted by researchers who had studied Ashworth's published work and trial records, produced results that were, in some ways, more refined than Ashworth's original work, and in some ways more brutal. The researchers developed techniques for more rapidly breaking down psychological resistance. They developed techniques for more precisely controlling specific behaviors through targeted psychological conditioning. They developed what they believed were techniques for creating human beings who could be programmed to perform specific tasks and then to forget they had performed those tasks. By 1935, the government-sponsored research facility had apparently terminated its operations. The facility was decommissioned. The research materials were classified and stored in secure government archives. The researchers were dispersed to other institutions and other projects. The subjects who had been used in the research were either transferred to state institutions or were simply released. No official accounting was ever made of how many subjects had been used in the research or what had become of them. No official acknowledgement was ever made that the research had occurred at all. But the research did not end. It simply transformed and evolved. In the decades following the termination of the government-sponsored facility in New York, similar research was apparently conducted at other locations and under other auspices. There are indications that research based on Ashworth's methodology was conducted in military facilities during and after World War II. There are indications that such research was conducted in CIA facilities in the 1950s and 1960s. There are indications that the fundamental techniques that Ashworth had developed for the systematic destruction and reconstruction of human consciousness were further refined and adapted by government researchers for whom Ashworth's original work served as a kind of intellectual foundation. In 1975, as a result of investigations into government abuses of power conducted by Congress, some of the classified material related to Ashworth's work and its adaptation by government agencies was declassified. A congressional committee investigating CIA activities discovered references to Ashworth's techniques in CIA research files. The committee discovered that a researcher named James Whitman had conducted research based on Ashworth's techniques in a CIA facility in the 1950s. The committee discovered that subjects for this research had been obtained from state psychiatric institutions without their knowledge or consent. The committee discovered that the research was designed to produce what was referred to in official documents as human assets, individuals who could be programmed to carry out specific tasks. The revelation that Ashworth's research had apparently served as the intellectual foundation for government-sponsored psychological torture research shocked the public. Congressional hearings were held, investigations were conducted. Some government officials were censured, though none were prosecuted. The officials responsible for the research claimed that they had been pursuing national security imperatives and that the research had been necessary for reasons of state security. They defended the research on grounds that it had been conducted for the purpose of defending the nation against foreign threats. But the broader question that emerged was whether the research had actually ended or whether it had simply become more hidden. Were there still government-sponsored research facilities conducting psychological conditioning experiments? Were there still subjects being used in such research? Were there still researchers working on refining the techniques that Ashworth had originally developed? These questions were never definitively answered. The declassified materials provided evidence that such research had been conducted and that it had been extensive. But the materials did not provide evidence about the current state of the research or about whether it continued in classified contexts. Thomas Fletcher, had he lived to see the declassified congressional materials, would have experienced a horrifying revelation. The torture he had endured at Ashworth's hands, the psychological breaking and rebuilding that he had suffered, had not been a unique and isolated crime. It had been a template. It had been a foundation for systematic government research that was apparently still ongoing at the time the congressional investigations were being conducted. His suffering had not been arbitrary. It had been part of a broader program. The techniques that had been used on him were apparently being refined and adapted for application to other subjects in other contexts. But Fletcher was long dead by the time these revelations emerged. He had died in 1892, 13 years after the closure of the secret ward, having lived those 13 years in a state of chronic psychiatric illness resulting from the conditioning he had experienced. The most disturbing aspect of the subsequent research based on Ashworth's methodology was that the basic theoretical framework remained unchanged. The fundamental belief remained that human consciousness could be deliberately fragmented and then reconstructed according to external will. The fundamental belief remained that through systematic application of psychological pressure and physical deprivation, a human mind could be broken into a state of absolute malleability. The fundamental belief remained that in such a state, a human being could be programmed to respond to commands with absolute obedience. What changed was the refinement of technique and the systematic application of the methodology on a larger scale and with greater resources than Ashworth had possessed. What changed was the integration of Ashworth's techniques with other emerging methodologies in the fields of psychology and neuroscience. What changed was the explicit connection between Ashworth's work and the practical objectives of military and intelligence agencies. In the decades following the 1975 congressional investigations, there was increased public awareness of the historical connection between Ashworth's work and subsequent government research. Historians began to investigate the history of Ashworth's techniques and their influence on government-sponsored research. Journalists wrote extended accounts of how Ashworth's secret ward had served as a kind of intellectual ancestor for later government programs. Public awareness grew that what had been done in the secret ward at Rumney Marsh was not an isolated atrocity, but rather part of a continuous historical thread, extending from Ashworth's original work through government-sponsored programs and potentially continuing into the present day. But public awareness did not translate into concrete action. The government agencies that had apparently sponsored research based on Ashworth's techniques were not held accountable. The researchers who had conducted such research were not prosecuted. The subjects who had been used in such research were not systematically identified or compensated. The fundamental questions about whether such research was continuing remained unanswered. By the 1990s, some of the surviving subjects of Ashworth's original work had begun to come forward and provide accounts of their experiences. These accounts, combined with the historical documentation that had emerged through congressional investigations, created a more complete picture of what had occurred in the secret ward. These accounts revealed psychological damage that persisted decades after the subjects had been released from the asylum. These accounts revealed the permanent nature of the conditioning that Ashworth had applied and the difficulty of psychological recovery from such conditioning. One of the surviving subjects, a woman named Elizabeth Morrison, no relation to William Morrison the whistleblower, provided a detailed account of her experience in the secret ward. She described being confined to sensory deprivation for extended periods. She described the sensory bombardment. She described the systematic destruction of her sense of identity. She described Ashworth's methods of rebuilding her psychology to make her dependent on his will. She described escaping the asylum after 3 years and attempting to build a life in the outside world. But she also described the persistent nightmares, the persistent dissociative episodes, the persistent difficulty in trusting other people or feeling secure in any context. What happened to me in that ward, Elizabeth Morrison stated in her account, was not treatment for a psychiatric condition. It was torture designed to transform me into something less than human. And while I escaped the physical walls of the asylum, I have never truly escaped the psychological walls that were constructed in my mind by Dr. Ashworth and his methods. Every day of my life since then has been a struggle to feel like a complete human being, to feel like I have agency over my own mind and my own life. Elizabeth Morrison died in 1998. She had spent the entire second half of her life attempting to recover from the psychological trauma of her 3 years in the secret ward. While she had survived physically and had managed to establish a relatively stable life, the psychological damage was never fully repaired. The fate of the other subjects remained largely unknown. Some had died in psychiatric institutions. Some had apparently recovered sufficiently to live relatively normal lives. Some had disappeared from official records entirely, and their ultimate fates remained undocumented. There was no systematic accounting of what had become of all the subjects who had been discovered in the secret ward, or of the approximately 23 subjects who were never recovered because they had been transferred to other locations before the discovery. What became clear through the historical investigation and documentation that accumulated over the decades was that the secret ward at Rumney Marsh was not unique. There appeared to have been other similar operations at other institutions. There appeared to have been a continuous thread of research based on Ashworth's methodology extending from the 1880s through at least the 1970s. There appeared to be systematic government sponsorship and support for research that was essentially a continuation and refinement of Ashworth's original work. And most disturbingly, there appeared to be no clear evidence that such research had been definitively terminated. In the 21st century, as historical interest in Ashworth's work and its influence has grown, the fundamental question remains unanswered. To what extent did Ashworth's discovery of techniques for breaking down and reconstructing human consciousness influence the development of interrogation and conditioning techniques used by intelligence agencies and military organizations? To what extent are the techniques that Ashworth originally developed still being used or still being refined in classified contexts? And most fundamentally, are there still individuals who have been subjected to psychological conditioning based on Ashworth's methodology and who are still operating in contexts where their conditioning controls their behavior? These questions cannot be definitively answered based on publicly available information. The classified materials that would allow complete answering of these questions remain classified. The government agencies that conducted research based on Ashworth's methodology have been largely evasive about the scope and current status of such research. The historical record provides evidence that such research was extensive and that it continued for many decades after Ashworth's conviction. But whether it continues today, in what contexts it occurs, and how many subjects have been subjected to such conditioning remain questions without definitive public answers. What we know with certainty is what happened in the secret ward at Rumney Marsh. We know that Dr. Marcus Ashworth developed systematic techniques for breaking down human consciousness and reconstructing it according to his will. We know that 83 people were subjected to these techniques. We know that the damage inflicted on these people was severe and in many cases permanent. We know that Ashworth's techniques served as a template for subsequent government-sponsored research. We know that such research was apparently conducted in military and intelligence facilities for at least a century after Ashworth's original work. What we cannot know with certainty, based on publicly available information, is whether that research has been definitively terminated or whether it continues in classified contexts. What we cannot know is how many subjects have been subjected to conditioning techniques derived from Ashworth's methodology. What we cannot know is whether there are individuals operating in military or intelligence contexts right now who have been psychologically conditioned using techniques that have their intellectual origin in Ashworth's secret ward. The story of the secret ward at Rumney Marsh is a story about the darkness that can exist within institutions. It is a story about how systematic abuse can be concealed and protected by the very systems designed to prevent such abuse. It is a story about how scientific research can be twisted to serve purposes of control and domination. It is a story about how governments can perpetuate and refine the techniques of abusers. And it is a story that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about how thoroughly we understand our own institutions and about what abuses might still be occurring in classified contexts that we are not permitted to see. What do you believe really happened to all the subjects who disappeared from Rumney Marsh? Do you think research based on Ashworth's techniques continues today in classified contexts? Subscribe, hit that notification bell, and tell us in the comments. Do you think the government has ever been fully transparent about the extent of psychological conditioning research? Where are you watching from? What country are you in? Because the story of Rumney Marsh Asylum raises questions that extend far beyond one asylum in one state in the 19th century. It raises questions about the nature of institutional power and institutional secrecy. It raises questions about how societies protect abusers when the abuse serves state interests. It raises questions about whether the techniques that Ashworth originally developed are still being used today, hidden from public view in classified facilities around the world.